Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this morning's webinar. I'll be talking about smart hiring in a cost-cutting era. Please do feel free to ask any questions as we go along. And I will just share my screen so you can see. Right, hopefully that's all working. Brilliant. Well, just a quick introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel. I'm an equity consultant at Vested. And I work with founders and leadership teams to help them build smart, sustainable share schemes. And today we're talking about hiring, and more specifically, how to attract and keep great people when your budget's feeling squeezed. It's a big challenge for recruitment agencies right now, but share schemes might just be the underused lever you've been looking for. Let's start with what you already know. The recruitment world is under pressure. Clients are negotiating hard on fees. Your best people are getting poached, and there's less cash to play with when it comes to bonuses or raises. So the real question is, how do you stay competitive when the money just isn't there? Salaries are expensive, bonuses can be quickly forgotten, and vague promises of growth don't really mean much when there's no clear path or upside. Meanwhile, your competitors are circling, ready to offer that shiny new package. We need to get smarter and stickier with how we reward people. Now, here's the opportunity. What if you could give your team a stake in the business without increasing your salary spend? Share schemes allow you to reward long-term impact, not just short-term wins, and they cost the business nothing upfront. Think of it as giving them a slice of the pie once the pie grows. Recruiters are already wired for performance-based rewards. You guys get commission culture, so equity fits. It creates an ownership mindset, helps reduce churn, and it feels like you're all growing the business together. And we call that the ownership effect. As you know, success depends on the whole team. So for most of you, that's likely to be employees, but it could also be freelancers, investors, fractionals, directors, or non-execs. And there are different share schemes that you can use to incentivize all of these people. EMI is the most common scheme, which I'm going to talk through. That's for UK-based employees. And there's also unapproved options and growth shares, which are the most common routes to go down for non-employees. I'm not going to go into CSOPs in a lot of detail, but if you're a much larger company with over 250 people, for example, or you're not in an EMI eligible sector, that could be a good route to go down as well. So EMI. This is a government approved scheme, stands for the Enterprise Management Incentive. It was set up by Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor, and actually every successive government has kept it in place because it's a very tax efficient way to award equity to your team. So there are some eligibility criteria for both the business and the recipients. So in terms of the business, there are some excluded sectors, such as banking, accounting, even shipbuilding, if there's any shipbuilders out there, which is unlikely given that this is about recruitment agencies. So in theory, most of you should be eligible. And it's for less than 250 employees, and you can't be majority owned by a third party. So if you are the sole founder or there's a few co-founders, that's absolutely fine. In terms of the recipients, they need to work a minimum of 25 hours a week. So actually, if you do have anybody part-time, they can also be eligible, but they need to work at least 25% of their time or 75%. Now, the tax benefit for this is that as long as they've held their shares for a minimum of 24 months, the only tax they have to pay is capital gains at the reduced rate of 18%. So really, really tax efficient, no income tax is due at all. Now, as part of this, we need to do a valuation. Now, the aim of this is a tax valuation, which is different to a valuation for investment or for even for exit. So typically, the aim of this is to try to get the company valuation as low as possible to give your team the maximum upside. It needs to be approved by HMRC, and it takes around 4 weeks to get that. There are also tax benefits for the company. So the whole gain that your team make is offsettable against corporation tax. So tax benefits for the individual, tax benefits for the company. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of how you can structure these schemes. I've just had a question through actually, which is around how often do you need a tax valuation for EMI? And these valuations last for 90 days. You don't have to have a valuation every 90 days. But if, for example, you were going to grant options now and then more in 6 months' time, you would then need another valuation at that point. As I mentioned earlier, please keep the questions coming. I'm very happy to answer them as we go along. Yeah, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how you structure the share schemes. And the best way to think about it is aligning the construct of these option agreements with the goals of the business. So if, for example, your aim is to sell the business in 5 years, the incentive would be to keep everybody on that journey. And so you can align it with that exit event. A lot of companies either don't know what their mid to long term plans are or are not planning to sell the company. And that's not a problem. So there can be a misconception that there's only any point in setting up a share scheme if you are going to sell the business. But actually, we talk a lot about the ownership effect. So actually, giving your team skin in the game makes a massive difference to how they respond to the company and their relationship with it. Rather than just being an employee, they are a shareholder. So if you want to incentivize retention, for example, you can set up a time-based vesting schedule. If you want to incentivize performance, then it can be linked to either individual or company KPIs. The alternative to EMI options, there are 2 routes you can go down. So one is unapproved options. There are no eligibility criteria for this scheme at all. So you can grant them to non-employees. You can grant them to people who are not based in the UK. Just had another question come in. Can you have both EMI and unapproved options? I don't know if you mean that as an individual or as a business. So if you are EMI eligible, it makes sense to go for the EMI scheme because they're much more tax efficient. But as a business, many companies have both employees and non-employees that they want to incentivize. And so it's very common to have 2 schemes running in parallel. I hope that answered your question. Please give more detail if it didn't. So they are set up in the same way. So they come out of the same options pool. So you can create one pool. So you might think philosophically, I'm happy to share up to 10% or 20% of my business with my team. So you create a pool of shares, of share options. And for those who are EMI eligible, you can grant EMI. And for those who are not, you can grant unapproved options out of the same pool. So very simple to set up. It's unlikely that you'd need to amend your articles of association. But as you can see, the comparison between EMI and unapproved options is not so great because from a tax point of view, as opposed to only paying 18% capital gains, you'd have to pay income tax at the time you buy them. Let me just answer a couple of these questions now. Can you attach conditions to EMI options? 100%, and you absolutely should. So you can attach conditions. So we're talking about conditional equity here. In some cases, you can offer it unconditionally. If, for example, somebody has been with you for 5 years and you want to reward them. But most of the time, 100% attach conditions to EMI options and the unapproved options. So they can be time-based, they can be KPI-based. If you work with a digital platform such as Vested, for example, it's very easy to create multiple variations of the share scheme agreement. So if you wanted to have specific KPIs for individual, you can create as many variations as you like. I've actually got some a quite good blog post, which, so if you wouldn't mind just sending me a message in the comments, I'd be happy to share some more information about the conditionality and also best practice guide as well. I've got another question here. I worked for a company that went all in on employee ownership. It lifted the entire business and things were great for a while. That feels like a mixed message there. Sounds great that things worked well for a while. I don't have any more context there as to what happened, so feel free to expand on that if you would like to, Daniel. The other thing with these is that as well as flexibility in terms of how you structure the scheme, there's also a lot of flexibility in terms of who you grant equity to. Now, I'm a firm believer in granting equity to everybody in the business, because why wouldn't you? You don't have to give everybody the same amount of shares, though. So if you have a senior team, then you might well want to grant them all. But, as I mentioned, the flexibility is there. Another question here around, can I reward non-UK employees? Absolutely, yes. So that's a good slide, a good question for this slide. So we're talking about unapproved options are for non-UK employees, but I also wanted to talk you through this slide here, which also talks about growth shares. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen me banging on about growth shares on LinkedIn, but these are not as well known as unapproved options, but they are way more tax efficient. So growth shares are a brilliant way to incentivize non-employees or non-UK employees. So it might be employees that are not based in the UK or UK-based non-employees, such as freelancers or consultants, coaches, advisors. So let's go into growth shares in a little bit more detail. So growth shares are a different class of share. So we would need to create a new share class. And again, there is flexibility. So I'll come on to the control elements in a minute. But when we're talking about options, and growth shares, they don't have to have the same rights as ordinary shares, potentially, that you have. So it might be that you have voting rights and dividend rights. Most people don't offer voting rights to their teams, but you can have discretionary dividends if you wanted to. The other thing with growth shares is that you would need to adopt articles of association. You can adopt ours for free if you've got standard articles, so that you have the provision for growth shares. Now, from a tax point of view, growth shares don't incur any income tax. They only incur capital gains, and that's at the point the shares are sold. So growth shares are nice because you can effectively gift the shares to your employees, but not at the current value. So if, for example, as we've got here, the current share price is £1, if you were to give shares to anybody at that price, they'd have to pay income tax. So the current value plus a small premium becomes what's known as the hurdle. So actually, if you yourself have created a lot of the value in the business and you want to incentivize your team to share in the growth from that time, growth shares are a brilliant way, because essentially they reward, it ring fences all of the current value for your existing shareholders, and it incentivizes the team to grow the business because they will share in the future growth that they help to create. So it's a very fair construct. Help us grow the business and you'll benefit in the growth. And if the business does not increase in value, then your shares won't be worth anything. So with growth shares, the recipients share in the future value that they help to create. Now, because the shares are not worth the hurdle point at the time they're granted, the recipients don't need to pay £1.20 for shares that are only worth £1. That wouldn't make sense. But they do need to pay something for them. So effectively, they can buy them at nominal value. So that might be a penny or a fraction of a penny. You can also attribute conditionality to these growth shares in the same way that we've talked about with EMI. You can have the same conditions. So it might be exit-based, KPI-based, time-based. So from the start, the growth shares are issued up front. So the recipient feels that sense of ownership from the very start. They know that as long as they fulfill their deliverables, they'll be able to keep the growth shares, or they'll be made unconditional. And if for whatever reason they leave before they've earned the right to them all, then they can be converted to deferred shares and cancelled. As people join the company in the future, you would also need to have another valuation to ensure that the hurdle price is relevant to that point. So really nice, easy construct with the growth shares. I've just seen a couple of questions come in. Do growth shares impact EIS eligibility? Great question. So it depends how your articles of association are constructed. So if you adopt the vested articles, for example, they have been specifically constructed to not have any conflict with SEIS or EIS eligibility. If you already have bespoke articles and you're working with your legal team to incorporate this, then you would need to make sure that you include these clauses so that it doesn't affect EIS eligibility. And another one, will the hurdle rate grow as the company grows? So the hurdle rate will increase for people that join in the future, but your hurdle rate is fixed. So that's the incentive. You get to share in the future growth of the company from the hurdle rate as per the time that you were granted your growth shares. And as I said in this slide here, as the company increases in value and you want to add more people to the growth share scheme, at that point, you would need to have another valuation. So important thing to remember with growth shares, really tax efficient, get the ownership effect up front, and not many people know about them. So share the word, spread the love for growth shares. I just touched on this a minute ago, but a lot of people do worry about control. So a lot of founders do worry that giving up equity means giving up control, but it doesn't. And also, you're not giving up equity without wanting to. This is why we talk about conditional equity and why it is so important to have conditions in place that motivate and incentivize the recipient, but that are also aligned with the company goals. So growth shares, EMI and unapproved options can come with no voting rights. They can have discretionary rights to dividends, but they don't have to. And also clawback clauses. So depending on what happens if the recipient leaves, you can choose different scenarios. So you might say, well, actually, if the whole aim of the share scheme that you create is around the journey to exit, you might say, well, look, if you leave the company before an exit, then you leave with nothing. Or you might say, well, actually, if you leave halfway through your time-based vesting, for example, then you can keep the amount that you have earned the right to, and the rest will lapse. So again, loads of flexibility in terms of how you structure it. And also to remember, you're sharing the upside, not the reins. So as founders, of course, you want to keep the control. And most people, as I mentioned, do set up the new share classes with no voting rights. So just a reminder of when to consider a share scheme. So if you're hiring somebody, but you can't compete on salary, if you want to really retain and motivate your top billers, again, if you're building a leadership team, also if you're looking at an MBO or a potential exit or a long-term scale. So essentially, any business that has a team should consider equity as a real way of differentiating from competitors and a way of incentivizing, long-term positive behaviors. I just got another question here. How soon can I set up a share scheme? Well, you can start the process now if you want. So there are some of the key things to consider. So I wouldn't recommend setting up a share scheme like immediately, because your equity is precious. And so it's really important to think about things properly. So I've got a really good guide that just talks about key questions to think about when you're setting up a share scheme. So if you would like me to share that, please drop a message in the comments and I will send it over to you. An EMI scheme typically takes around 2 to 3 months to set up. A lot of that time is waiting for HMRC to approve the valuation. Growth shares and unapproved options tend to take less time because you don't need an HMRC approved valuation. In terms of implementing the scheme on a platform like Vested, that's very simple and straightforward. But what sometimes takes time is thinking about what percentage of the company you want to share with your team. Are you going to make it company-wide, or are you going to just have it for certain individuals? Are you going to have performance-based KPIs or time-based KPIs? So there's a lot of things for you to think through. And okay, brilliant. I can see a few of you have asked for that guide, so I'll happily share that with you shortly. So EMI scheme, in summary, between 2 to 3 months, and the other schemes I'd say could be done within, a few weeks. I know I've talked quite a lot here. It's been a sort of deep dive into the share schemes, but the main things to remember are that share schemes are a brilliant way to increase loyalty, align everyone around the growth of your business, and it's a relatively cost-effective way to do it. On our standard plan, for example, you can set up a share scheme for up to 10 people for £2,900. So there is more information on the Vested website. So please do have a read. We've got loads of brilliant free resources on vested.com. And finally, if you've got any other questions, please do post them in the chat. Here's one. If I used Vested, can I manage the entire scheme through the platform? 100% yes. So with Vested, for example, we're effectively a one-stop shop where we have a team of in-house valuations analysts that can do the EMI or growth shares or unapproved valuations for you. We have a scheme designer where you can put together your share scheme agreements for all of your recipients. You also have to do an annual HMRC notification for all of the schemes, and we pre-fill that for you. We actually have an integration with Companies House as well, so it takes away all the hassle for the filings. That can all be done directly via the platform. And we've also done quite a lot around recipient engagement. So it's really, really, really important that your team understand what the share scheme is, what the benefit is to them, and how it works. Because if they don't understand it and aren't motivated by it, I would say you're wasting your money. Another question in, can my accountant do it for me? What's more cost effective? So some accountants, so Vested, we specialise in share schemes. Not many accountants do specialise in share schemes. Some of them can do valuations, and I've heard a massive range of fees for doing it. So some are fairly sensibly priced, so it might be £1,500 upwards, but I have also heard some crazy figures of sort of £6,000 to £10,000 for an EMI valuation. In addition to the valuation, you would then also need to work with a lawyer to put together your share scheme documents. And there isn't a digital way of engaging the team with the scheme. So, you know, having a dynamic dashboard where the team can play around with different scenarios and see in pounds, you know, what their shares could be worth is much more incentivizing than having a static document that you put in your drawer and possibly lose. So, I mean, if you do have a friendly accountant, it's definitely worth asking them. With Vested, for example, you can give your accountant access to the platform if you wanted to. And they would then also be able to do all the filings via it as well. So, you know, it's worth having a chat with other people, but there aren't many share scheme specialists that do the whole end-to-end bit. So you can find that the costs can creep up. So I would say with Vested, our pricing is very transparent, and our aim is to make it as cost effective as possible, because we firmly believe in democratizing equity. So, you know, you don't have to have millions of pounds as an investor. You can also gain equity through delivery and through, working with the company, which is a brilliant thing. If you have any more questions, please feel free to post them. And if you think of anything afterwards, do also feel free to just, drop me a DM, post any comments, and I'm happy to have a chat with you. You can also book in a call with me if that would be useful. But I will definitely drop some of those useful guides that I mentioned in here. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and have a great day.